Grayson Cole had always loved the mountains. He had been born into a world that was tough, cold, and unforgiving. But that was exactly how he liked it. There were no people around to bother him, no crowds, just the quiet of the wild. The snow-capped peaks, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the solitude of the open wilderness made him feel alive. For many years, it had been just him and his traps, his rifle, and his horse. It was a lonely life, but Grayson was used to it. His small log cabin, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pine trees, was his sanctuary. There, he could forget the world. He had lived there for nearly a decade now, ever since his wife had passed away. She had died of a sickness, a slow and painful death that Grayson couldn't do anything about. After her death, he couldn't bear to stay in the town they had lived in. The memories of her were everywhere, in the rooms, in the air, and even in the town itself. So he had packed up and left, disappearing into the wilderness. But over the years, the loneliness had begun to weigh heavily on him. It wasn't that he minded being alone. He had come to appreciate the stillness and the quiet. But there were times, especially during the long, harsh winters, when he felt the ache of having no one around. Still, Grayson kept to himself. He had always believed that people would only cause trouble, so he avoided them whenever possible. The only company he had were his animals, the few trusted horses and dogs he had raised and trained. One evening, as Grayson finished his chores around the cabin, he heard a sound in the distance. It wasn't the usual wildlife sounds, the calls of coyotes, or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. This was something different. A faint whinny. Grayson paused and squinted into the growing darkness. The sound was coming from the direction of the woods, a little beyond where his horses were usually kept. At first, he thought it might just be a wild animal, but then he heard the sound again this time. A little closer, curious and cautious, Grayson grabbed his rifle and walked toward the noise. The cold wind bit at his face, and the snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way through the thick trees. The sun was setting, and the darkening sky made it harder to see. But Grayson's sharp eyes were trained to spot anything out of place. As he neared the edge of his property, he stopped, his heart pounding slightly in his chest. There, under the trees, a figure stood by his horse. The woman's back was turned, and she was struggling with the horse's reins, trying to lead it away from the area. Grayson's instincts immediately kicked in. His horse was the one thing he valued above all else. He had raised the animal from a foal, and it had helped him countless times in the mountains. No one was going to take it from him, not without a fight. He stepped forward, making his presence known with a soft cough. The woman froze, then spun around, her hand still gripping the reins tightly. Grayson stood there for a moment, staring at her. The woman was thin, with pale skin and disheveled hair, her clothes ragged and torn. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. But what struck Grayson the most was the look in her eyes, a mixture of desperation, fear, and something else he couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grayson just stood there, rifle in hand, watching her closely. She seemed startled at first, but then her expression softened. She was clearly caught, but she didn't seem scared. In fact, she seemed almost resigned to her fate. "I didn't mean no harm," she said finally. Her voice quiet but firm. Grayson raised an eyebrow, not lowering his rifle. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. The woman swallowed hard, glancing down at the reins in her hands. I need the horse," she said. "I'm sorry, but I've got nothing else left. I thought I could ride it to the nearest town, maybe find someone who can help me." Grayson didn't move, but he could see the truth in her words. She didn't look like someone who would risk stealing a horse without a good reason. There was an air of exhaustion about her, a weariness that went beyond just being hungry or tired. This woman had been through something that had driven her to desperation. "Why didn't you come to my cabin?" Grayson asked, his voice softer now. Could have asked for help. She looked down at the ground, then back at him. Her eyes filled with sorrow. "I didn't want to bother you. I didn't know who you were, or if you'd help. I've lost everything. My husband, my life. I just don't know what else to do. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Grayson had seen people suffer before he'd seen it in the towns he passed through, in the eyes of travelers who couldn't make it in the wilderness. But this woman was different. She wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for a chance, even if it meant stealing from him. Grayson hesitated for a long time. Watching her closely, he knew that he could call her out for trying to steal his horse, that he could send her away into the cold. But something in him stirred. Something about her pain reached him, and he couldn't bring himself to send her away. "Keep it," he said finally, lowering his rifle just a fraction. "But stay with me." The woman blinked, clearly surprised. "What?" Grayson shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I don't mind if you keep the horse, but you can't just take it and leave. It's dangerous out here alone. You can stay here with me until you figure things out." She stared at him in shock. She had expected anger, punishment, maybe even violence. But instead, Grayson had offered her something she hadn't expected, a place to stay, a way out of her misery. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she nodded slowly, a small sigh escaping her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. Grayson nodded once, then turned back toward the cabin without another word. He knew this wasn't the ideal situation. He wasn't used to having anyone around, let alone a woman in his cabin. But he had to admit, a small part of him felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. As they walked back to the cabin together, the mountain man couldn't help but wonder what had brought this woman to his doorstep, and what the future would hold. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that she had a place to stay, and so did he. As the days passed, Grayson and Eleanor found a rhythm in their new, uneasy arrangement. The first few days were quiet, almost too quiet. Eleanor was grateful for the shelter, but she didn't know what to expect from Grayson. He was a man of few words, his face often hidden beneath a thick beard, his dark eyes watching her with a quiet intensity. She tried her best to stay out of his way, only offering help when it seemed necessary. At first, Grayson didn't say much to her. He was used to solitude, and the presence of another person in his cabin felt strange. He had his routines. He would wake up before dawn, chop firewood, check the traps, and go hunting. Eleanor, on the other hand, was still trying to adjust to the wilderness. She had grown up in a small town, and though she had learned some skills from her late husband, nothing had prepared her for the harshness of mountain life, despite her lack of experience. Grayson could see that she was trying. She was resourceful, and she didn't complain, even when the cold wind would blow through the cracks of the cabin or when food was scarce. At night, she would sit by the fire, quietly mending clothes or reading the few books she had brought with her. Occasionally, she would look at Grayson and offer him a small smile, but he never seemed to return it. Still, she felt a strange comfort in his presence. Even though he was quiet and didn't say much, there was something about the way he moved, the way he took care of the cabin, the animals, and the land that made her feel safe. It was as though he was the mountain itself, solid, unyielding, and dependable. It wasn't a romantic feeling, at least not at first, but over time, Eleanor began to realize how much she appreciated him. He wasn't the man she had expected him to be, the gruff, hard man of the wild. Instead, he was a man who had endured loss, much like her. Grayson, in turn, found himself growing used to Eleanor's presence. She wasn't like the other women he had met in his travels. She didn't complain or try to make small talk. She didn't ask questions about his past or try to change him. She simply accepted the silence, and it made Grayson more comfortable than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he missed having someone else around, someone who understood what it meant to survive in such a harsh place. As the days turned into weeks, they began to work together more often. Eleanor started helping Grayson with the chores around the cabin, learning how to fix things, tend to the animals, and cook simple meals. She wasn't a natural at first, burning food, fumbling with the tools. But Grayson never seemed frustrated with her. He showed her how to do things with patience, his gruff voice offering instructions that were often more practical than comforting. But there was something about the way he looked at her. When she managed to get something right, a silent approval that meant more than any words could. Despite the growing bond between them, Grayson kept his distance emotionally. He was kind, but he was careful not to let his guard down. Every time Eleanor would try to talk about her past or ask about his, he would deflect the conversation. He wasn't ready to share his pain with anyone, not even her. His past was buried in the mountains, in the loss of his wife and the life he had left behind. He had come to terms with his solitude, and it was safer that way. One day, after weeks of living together, the weather took a turn for the worse. The sky grew dark, and the wind howled through the trees. Grayson knew that a storm was coming, and he needed to prepare. He made sure the cabin was secure, checked the supplies, and gathered extra firewood. Eleanor helped where she could, though she had never been in a storm like the one that was brewing. Grayson could see the fear in her eyes as the storm approached, and despite his natural inclination to keep to himself, he found himself reassuring her. "It's just a storm," he said, his voice low. "We'll be fine. The cabin's strong." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. As the night wore on, the storm hit with full force. The wind howled like a pack of wolves outside, and the snow came down in thick, heavy sheets, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. But even with the fire, the chill of the storm made it feel colder inside than it actually was. Eleanor sat by the fire, her eyes flicking nervously to the windows, watching the storm rage outside. She had never experienced anything like it before. The howling wind and the constant rattle of the cabin's wooden walls made her feel small, vulnerable. She wrapped a blanket tightly around her shoulders, but still, the cold seemed to seep into her bones. Grayson sat across the room, sharpening his knives. His face was calm, almost detached, as he worked. He didn't seem bothered by the storm at all. It was just another part of life in the mountains, something he had come to accept long ago. "Do you ever get scared?" Eleanor asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Grayson paused, looking up at her. There was a moment of silence before he answered. "No," he said simply. "The storm doesn't scare me. It's just something that happens." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. For a moment, she thought about the things that scared her. The uncertainty of her life, the loss of everything she had known, the fear of being alone forever. She had been running from those fears for so long. But being in the mountains with Grayson had given her a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. The storm raged through the night, but by morning it had passed, leaving behind a fresh layer of snow in a world that looked quiet and peaceful. Grayson went outside to check the traps, and Eleanor followed, not wanting to be alone in the cabin. She had grown accustomed to his company, and even though they hadn't spoken much, she found herself wanting to be near him. As they walked through the snow-covered forest, Grayson pointed out tracks in the snow, showing her how to read the land. He taught her how to recognize the signs of animals, how to find food, and how to survive when the weather turned cold. Eleanor, for the first time, began to feel like she wasn't just surviving, but actually living in this wild, beautiful place. And though Grayson didn't say much, he began to notice the way Eleanor was changing. She was stronger, more confident, and she had a quiet determination about her that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. She was beginning to find her place in this harsh world, just as he had. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the quiet between them was different. There was no tension, no discomfort. It was simply the peaceful silence of two people who had learned to accept each other. And for the first time in years, Grayson felt something stir within him, something that he had long buried. Eleanor, too, felt it. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she knew that this place, this life, had changed her. She had come here to escape, to run away from the past, but now, in the mountains with Grayson, she was beginning to understand what it meant to live again. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something new had begun, something neither Grayson nor Eleanor had expected. They didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to find out.